Every single time you have bought a laptop in the last 30 years, you have been paying a fee that nobody ever asked you about, nobody told you was optional, and nobody gave you a choice to refuse. It was bundled into the price of your machine whether you wanted it or not, and the company collecting it was Microsoft. It is called the Windows tax. And Lenovo, the largest PC manufacturer on the planet, just quietly made it optional. That single move is more significant than most people realize, and in this video we are going to break down exactly what it means for your wallet, your freedom as a consumer, and where the entire personal computer industry might be heading because of it. Welcome back, and if you're new here, this channel is where we break down the technology stories that actually matter to your life. Not just the spec sheets and the benchmarks, but the decisions being made in corporate boardrooms that end up affecting what you pay and what you can do with the devices you own. So make sure you stick around, because this one touches every single person who has ever bought a computer. Let us start with what the Windows tax actually is, because a lot of people have heard the term but never really understood the full picture. When a manufacturer like Lenovo, Dell, HP, or Asus builds a laptop and sells it DMS-OU, they are not just charging you for the hardware. They are also charging you for a Windows license that Microsoft requires them to bundle with the machine. Now here's the thing that makes this feel like a tax rather than a purchase. You do not get to opt out. You do not get to say, actually, I would prefer to run Linux, so take Windows off the machine and give me a discount. In the traditional model, that conversation simply did not exist. The Windows license was in the price, transferred to the machine, and if you wanted to use a different operating system, you still paid for Windows anyway and then installed whatever you actually wanted on top of it. You were paying for a product you did not need, could not return, and never consented to buying separately. The Supreme Court of Italy actually ruled on this in 2014, calling the practice a commercial policy of forced distribution and calling it monopolistic in tendency, ordering a manufacturer to refund the Windows license cost to a buyer who did not want it. That ruling was confirmed on appeal 2 years later. Courts in multiple countries have recognized the problem. The market, until very recently, largely ignored them. The Windows tax has not been a fixed, publicly disclosed number because Microsoft negotiates OEM license deals privately with each manufacturer. But the scale of it becomes clear when you look at what happens when you remove it. In April 2025, a Reddit post from a Canadian user went viral in the tech community after they noticed something unusual on the Lenovo website. The same ThinkPad X1 Carbon laptop, identical hardware, identical specs, was listed at 2 different prices depending on which operating system you selected during checkout. Choose Windows, you pay the standard price. Choose Ubuntu Linux or Fedora Linux instead. And the price drops BY $140 in the United States and by $211 in Canada. Like and subscribe right now, because when a laptop drops $140 just by switching the operating system, that is not a minor detail. That is a structural insight into how much of your laptop price was never really about the laptop at all. The ThinkPad X1 Carbon is not a budget machine. It is one of Lenovo's premium business laptops, a device that professionals pay significant money to own. The fact that $140 of that price in the US market and over $200 in Canada exists purely because of a Windows license gives you a concrete, real-world number to attach to something that has been vague and debated for decades. And this matters because Lenovo is not some fringe company dabbling in alternative configurations. Lenovo is the world's largest PC manufacturer. When they offer a $140 discount for choosing Linux over Windows on a flagship business laptop and make that option visible and accessible during a standard checkout process, they are not doing something radical. They are doing something that was always possible, but that the industry had no commercial incentive to make convenient. Now, to be fair, Lenovo has reportedly been offering Linux pre-installed ThinkPads since at least 2020. This is not a brand new program. But what made the April 2025 moment different is that the conversation went mainstream. Regular users saw the price difference, shared it, and started asking the question that the industry had always preferred they not ask: what exactly am I paying for when I buy a Windows laptop? And the answer that came back was uncomfortable for Microsoft. You are paying, among other things, for a software license to an operating system that a growing number of users either do not need or actively do not want. The retail price of a Windows 11 home. License from Microsoft is $139. Windows 11 Pro runs $190. Manufacturers pay less than that through OEM bulk pricing, but those exact figures are not publicly disclosed. What is publicly known is that the savings passed on to Linux buyers on Lenovo's website match almost exactly what you would expect the Windows license cost were simply subtracted from the price. That transparency, even if unintentional, is remarkable. Let us talk about why this is happening now, because timing matters here, and the timing is not a coincidence. October 2025 marked the official end of life for Windows 10, the operating system that had been running on hundreds of millions of PCs worldwide. Microsoft ended security updates for Windows 10, meaning that every machine still running it was no longer receiving patches for newly discovered vulnerabilities. Microsoft's recommended solution was for users to upgrade to Windows 11. But Windows 11 came with a hardware requirement that millions of existing PCs simply cannot meet. It requires a TPM 2.0 security chip, and a large percentage of perfectly functional machines bought during the Windows 10 era do not have one. Microsoft's answer to those users was essentially to buy a new computer. That is, a lot of users being told their working hardware is now obsolete for reasons that have nothing to do with whether the hardware actually works. The response from those users was not uniform. A significant number of them did exactly what Microsoft wanted and bought new machines, but a meaningful and measurable number of them chose a different path. Zorin OS, a Linux distribution specifically designed to be easy for Windows users to switch to, reported over 780,000 Windows users transitioning to Linux in direct response to the Windows 10 end-of-life announcements. Linux desktop market share globally reached 4.7% in 2025, up from 2.76% in 2022. The United States crossed the 5% Linux desktop market share threshold for the first time in June 2025. These numbers look small in isolation, but the trajectory is what matters. Linux desktop adoption has been growing at 70% over 3 years, and that growth rate is accelerating precisely because of moments like the Windows 10 end of life and Microsoft's increasingly aggressive push toward hardware upgrades and subscription-based services. Like and subscribe, because the moment millions of ordinary people started asking whether Linux was good enough for daily use, the answer started coming back yes far more often than it ever had before. The gaming side of this story is particularly important for understanding how Linux has transformed as a platform. For most of the last 2 decades, the biggest barrier to Linux adoption for average users was not technical incompetence, and it was not a lack of good software. It was games. Windows had them. Linux largely did not. Valve's Steam platform, which is the world's largest PC gaming distribution service with over 132 million monthly active users, historically ran only on Windows. If you wanted to game on a PC, you needed Windows. Full stop. That barrier is now almost entirely gone. Valve, the company behind Steam, made a strategic decision years ago to invest heavily in making Linux a legitimate gaming platform. They developed a compatibility layer called Proton that allows Windows games to run on Linux systems, and they backed that investment with hardware by launching the Steam Deck, a handheld gaming device that runs SteamOS, which is a Linux-based operating system. The Steam Deck has sold approximately 8 million units by the end of 2025. And here is what that means in terms of market data. Linux hit a 3.58% share of all Steam users in December 2025, the highest ever recorded. Nearly 90% of Windows games now run on Linux through Proton compatibility technology. For the vast majority of games that the vast majority of players actually want to play, the operating system barrier has effectively been eliminated. When Lenovo included the Lenovo Legion Go S, one of their gaming handheld devices, in their lineup running SteamOS, it was a direct signal about where the market is heading. SteamOS is Linux, and if SteamOS is good enough to run your games on a dedicated gaming handheld sold by the world's largest PC manufacturer, then the argument that Linux is not ready for gaming as a daily driver becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. The people making that argument 5 years ago were largely correct. The people making it today are increasingly not. Like and subscribe, because the transformation of Linux from a technical curiosity for computer science majors into a legitimate, game-ready daily driver operating system is one of the most important and underreported technology stories of the last decade. So what does this all mean for you as a consumer right now? If you are in the market for a new laptop, particularly a business class or developer-oriented machine, the Lenovo website gives you a concrete financial decision to consider. On certain ThinkPad models, choosing Ubuntu or Fedora over Windows saves you $140 at the current time. Ubuntu and Fedora are both mature, well-supported Linux distributions. Ubuntu is one of the most widely used operating systems in the world among developers and in enterprise environments. Fedora is maintained by Red Hat, one of the most respected names in enterprise software. Both are free, both receive regular security updates, both support a vast ecosystem of productivity software, and both run modern web browsers, office suites, code editors, media players, and communication tools with no meaningful functional difference from what most users do on Windows every day. The honest caveat here is that not all laptops in Lenovo's lineup offer the Linux option. THE ThinkPad line, which has historically been designed with Linux compatibility in mind and has had components certified to work with the Linux kernel, is the primary place you will find this choice available. The consumer. Oriented Yoga and IdeaPad lines and the gaming-focused Legion lineup do not universally offer Linux configurations during checkout. So the choice exists, but it is not yet universal across Lenovo's entire catalog. That is worth being honest about. There's also the question of what you actually need a computer for. If your workflow revolves around specific Windows-only applications, particularly in the creative space, professional audio production, or certain industry-specific tools, then a Linux laptop is not going to be a seamless drop-in replacement today. The Adobe Creative Suite remains Windows and Mac OS exclusive, and while there are open-source alternatives for many creative tasks, they are not identical replacements. If your job requires specific software that only runs on Windows, the $140 savings does not outweigh the cost of losing access to the tools you need. That is a genuine limitation, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. But for a growing number of users, particularly developers, system administrators, students, researchers, writers, and anyone whose computing life primarily happens in a web browser and a set of web-based or cross-platform tools, Linux in 2025 is genuinely good enough to be a daily driver. The browser wars are over and the browser won. Chrome, Firefox, and other major browsers run on Linux. Google Workspace, Microsoft 365 via the web, Zoom, Slack, Discord, Spotify, and virtually every major. Web-based service runs on Linux through a browser just as well as it does on Windows. The era when choosing Linux meant accepting constant friction and missing software is fading, though it has not entirely disappeared. What Lenovo is doing by making this price difference visible is essentially forcing a conversation that the industry has spent decades avoiding. They are saying, out loud and in their pricing, that Windows costs money and Linux is free, and if you do not need Windows, you should not have to pay for it. That principle seems obvious. It is revolutionary in practice because the PC industry has been built on the opposite assumption for 30 years. The financial relationship between Microsoft and PC manufacturers has been so deeply embedded in how computers are sold that most consumers never even knew it existed. The $140 difference on a ThinkPad X1 Carbon is not just a discount. It is a receipt showing you a cost that was always there but was never itemized. Like and subscribe, because for millions of buyers, that receipt changes the calculation of what they thought they were getting for their money. The broader implication here is about competition and what happens when a meaningful alternative becomes genuinely viable. Microsoft has held an extraordinary position of dominance in the desktop operating system market for decades. That dominance has come with a pricing power that has been largely unchallenged. Windows 11 Home retails for $139. Windows 11 Pro retails for $199. Microsoft raised Windows Server 2025 pricing by 10 to 20% compared to the previous version, continuing a pattern of annual price increases since 2022. The company has also been moving aggressively toward subscription models, with Microsoft 365 subscriptions required for full access to Office applications that users previously paid for once and owned outright. Each of these moves has a compounding effect. The end-of-life forcing function from Windows 10, the hardware requirements of Windows 11 that made millions of existing PCs obsolete, the subscription push, the embedded cost in every new laptop. These are not accidental features of Microsoft's business. They are deliberate structures that maximize revenue capture from a captive audience. And the key word there is captive. What happens when part of that audience finds the exit? That is the question that Lenovo's pricing transparency is beginning to answer. The Linux ecosystem in 2025 is more capable, more polished, and more accessible than it has been at any point in its history. The gaming barrier is falling. The cloud-based software revolution has reduced the importance of OS-specific desktop applications for many users. Hardware manufacturers like Lenovo have been working for years to ensure that their ThinkPad components are compatible with the Linux kernel, which means Linux on a ThinkPad is a rough experiment. It is a supported configuration that works. The combination of a $140 price difference, a genuinely ready alternative operating system, and a user base that is increasingly motivated by frustration with Microsoft's direction creates a set of conditions that has never quite existed before in the history of personal computing. Whether this becomes a tipping point or a footnote depends on a lot of factors that are still unresolved. Mainstream users who have never heard of Ubuntu are not going to read a Reddit thread about Lenovo's pricing and immediately switch their workflow. The cultural weight of Windows, the familiarity of the interface, the comfort of knowing that whatever software someone recommends will definitely run on your machine. These are real advantages that do not disappear because a price comparison shows up on a tech news site. Microsoft is not going to lose the desktop market because one laptop manufacturer makes Linux slightly cheaper than Windows. That is not how technology transitions work. But here is what is true. Every transition in computing history started with exactly this kind of quiet, structural shift happening under the surface while the mainstream ignored it. Mobile computing did not disrupt the PC industry overnight. Cloud computing did not empty corporate data centers in a single quarter. Linux did not conquer servers by winning a single dramatic battle. These transitions happen through the accumulation of moments where the alternative becomes good enough, accessible enough, and affordable enough that a meaningful segment of users makes a different choice. Lenovo, the Windows tax visible and optional, is one of those moments. It is not the revolution. It is the moment that makes the revolution visible to people who were not already looking for it. For you, right now, the takeaway is straightforward. If you are buying a new laptop and you are comfortable with Linux or willing to learn, check the Lenovo website and see whether the model you're considering offers a Linux configuration. If it saves you $140 and you can do everything you need to do on Linux, that is real money back in your pocket, and you are not giving up meaningful functionality to get it. If you need Windows for specific software, keep Windows and know that what you are paying includes a licensing fee that is now explicitly visible on at least one major manufacturer's website. And either way, pay attention to how this story develops, because the fact that the world's largest PC manufacturer has made this choice as visible and financially concrete as they have is a signal that the ground underneath the Windows monopoly is shifting in ways that have not been visible before. Like and subscribe, stay with this channel, and we will keep tracking where this goes. There is one more angle to this story that does not get enough attention, and it is the developer angle. Software developers represent a disproportionately influential user segment in the technology industry. They are early adopters, they are opinion leaders, and they have a practical reason to care about. Consumers do not. Their tools run better on Unix-like systems. Linux and macOS share a Unix foundation, which means that the development environment, the command line tools, the server environments they deploy code to, and the software they write all feel more consistent on Linux or macOS than they do on Windows. The Stack Overflow. Developer survey in 2025 found that 27.8% of developers use Ubuntu for personal use and 27.7% use it professionally. Debian follows as the second most popular Linux distribution among developers. These are not marginal numbers. More than a quarter of all professional software developers are working on Linux today. When those developers choose their next laptop, a $140 discount on a machine that runs their preferred operating system natively is a financially meaningful and practically significant factor. And developers' computing setups to non-technical friends and colleagues carry influence that extends far beyond their own purchase decisions. The competitive pressure on Microsoft from this direction is not hypothetical. Microsoft knows that the developer community has been drifting toward Linux for years, which is a significant reason why they invested in the Windows subsystem for Linux, a feature that lets Windows users run Linux environments inside Windows without a dual boot setup. The WSL was Microsoft's attempt to make Windows feel like Linux enough that developers would not leave. It has been genuinely useful and widely adopted. But it is also an acknowledgement that Windows on its own was no longer fully meeting the needs of its most technically sophisticated users. Every time Microsoft has to add a Linux compatibility layer to retain developers, the argument that Windows is indispensable gets a little weaker. And every time Lenovo sells a ThinkPad with Ubuntu for $140 less than the Windows version, the financial case for developers and power users to take the step fully becomes a little stronger. The story of Lenovo cutting the Windows tax is ultimately a story about what happens when a market structure that has been in place for 3 decades starts to crack under the pressure of better alternatives, frustrated consumers, and manufacturers who sense an opportunity. Lenovo has not declared war on Microsoft. They have not made a grand statement about operating system freedom. They have simply made visible a price difference that has always existed but was never shown to ordinary consumers in a checkout flow. That kind of transparency, quiet and undramatic as it appears, is often how the big structural changes in technology begin. Like and subscribe. Share this with someone who has ever wondered why their laptop costs what it costs, because the answer just got a lot more concrete.